All right, so in today's video, we're going to wrap up our animated scene of the spaceship sucking up the palm tree. So just a little what's the word I'm trying to think of? Not revision, review. Just a little review of what we accomplished on Tuesday. So, and we did all of this in the frame by frame animation technique. So we animated the spaceship to move across the sky. I animated mine to fly behind and then in front of the moon, and then it hovers over the palm tree, it stops for a moment, shoots its little rays down, and now we're ready for the next part of the animation. So if you'll see, we don't have much room left to animate much. At least that's the way it looks in my timeline. Yours might look different, and that's okay. So don't panic if yours doesn't look like mine. Just as long as you see a very similar result in the composition window, that's the most important thing. So in order to be able to animate the rest of our scene, we're going to need to be able to see more of our scene. So here's just a little ungraded pop quiz question. What do we need to do next so that we can see the rest of the environment to be able to complete our animation? What do we usually do now to extend the visibility? What do we do to do that? Because as you can see, my timeline is going to run out of imagery right about at frame 300. And we're going to need more space to animate in. So how do we extend that? Do you guys remember? Very close. Not the keyframe, but you were so close. All you need to do is select, and I would just select a column of these frames. So these are not keyframes. They're not showing any change in the visual elements. It's simply just showing the visibility. And once you select this last column of frames, you can hold the mouse button down and click and just drag. Now that's one way to do it. I noticed that it created keyframes when I did that, and I don't think I really am comfortable with having a keyframe at the end of my timeline. And the reason why is because the keyframe is always going to have some sort of influence on that visual element. So if we decide somewhere along the lines of one of these layers to animate one of these objects, this keyframe at the end is always going to be gently tugging on that visual element to reset itself to whatever state it was in at this keyframe. So actually it'll just snap to it at the end like a simple frame by frame animation. So I'm going to undo this by going Command Z, and we're going to do this a different way. We're just going to scroll through the timeline and go out far enough. I'm going to go out to about frame 420. And I'm going to select this column of frames by holding the Shift key down. Let me make sure I get everything. I need to get every layer from the top down. So make sure that you use the scroll bar to make sure you're scrolling down to get the very last frame at the end of that column. So now my whole column is highlighted blue. And once it's highlighted blue, then I can just press F5, and that will just extend the visibility of all the content on all of those layers all the way out to, at least in my timeline, frame 420. And it did that without creating a keyframe at the end.
You said shift down and then what?
So let me do those steps one more time. I'm going to Command Z and take it back to the way it was, and I'm going to show you this process again. So I'm going to grab this column of frames. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. I was trying to scroll vertically. So I'll use my scroll bar here to scroll down, make sure I get the very last frame of this column. So you see this whole column is now selected. Oh wait, we're not doing it that way. I'm sorry, that was for the click and drag approach. That was the wrong way to do it. Okay, Command Z, I apologize. I'm going to scroll out to about frame 420 in my timeline. And I'm going to select the very bottom frame at that point in the timeline. I'll hold the Shift key down And when I hold the shift key down and I scroll up to get the very top frame, that allows me to select all of the frames in between. So that I'm just selecting from the bottom frame and the top frame, and it selects that entire column of frames. So once those are selected, then you just hit F5 on the keyboard, and that will just extend the visibility of those frames out to that place in the timeline without creating keyframes. So we don't really want to create keyframes, or we don't want to extend the timeline in a way that creates keyframes at the end. Let's just extend the visibility. So how's everybody doing with that? Everybody there? Cool. And don't be afraid to stop me at any point. I'm always happy to go back and re-show you things. All right, so yes.
I think I accidentally created a keyframe on one of those.
Okay, so Command Z to remove those steps. And just try it once again, just that whole process again. Okay, so now we are ready to animate the palm tree. So here's what we're going to do. Now remember, at the beginning of the animation, trying to get back to the very beginning. At the very beginning of the animation, we just see the shadow, of the palm tree. And so if you'll remember, I'm going to scrub down to where the palm tree changes from shadow to color. I'm just going to remind you what's happening in that level. So here's the colorful palm layer. Okay, so if you can see on this layer, there is nothing visible at the moment. So we just see blank frames. But if you look at the palm layer, it's one of these palm layers. If you look at the palm layer beneath that, the shadow layer, and I should have named it palm shadow so it'd be a little bit more obvious. So this is all that we see on the stage and in the timeline until we get to the point where the spaceship hovers over the palm tree and shines its light on it. So it does its little inspection, and then it shines a light beam on it. And that is the first place in the timeline where the colorful palm becomes visible. And then it does a gradual change in opacity. So we made that change in opacity with just simple keyframes. So with each keyframe, we increase the opacity of the colorful palm. And we did that in sync with the ray beam. If you'll notice right beneath that, you should see keyframes that align with the keyframes of the colorful palm, where both of these elements animate in by becoming more opaque. So now we've illuminated the full color palm tree, and we have animated the beam, creating the illusion that it's making the palm tree light up so we can see it. And we don't need that shadow layer anymore, because from now on, we're just going to see this colorful palm tree. So now we can turn our attention to the palm shadow layer, and let's just unlock that. And we're going to create a new keyframe right beneath the final row of keyframes for the ray beam and the colorful palm. So just click in that column where a frame should be, and you're going to insert a blank keyframe. So to do that, you'll right-click with your mouse, or you can press the Control key on your keyboard and click one time to get the timeline's special editing menu, and then just choose Insert Blank Keyframe. And now the palm tree is gone, the shadow one. So it's just like, almost like a passing the baton, in a relay. So the animation in the beginning of our story, it's the shadow palm that you see until the spaceship shines light on the colorful palm, and then we turn off the visibility of the shadow. And now we're ready to animate the palm being sucked up into the spaceship. So we're going to accomplish this still using the frame-by-frame animation technique, but we're going to we're going to change this palm tree's position, so its location. It's going to move vertically up toward the spaceship. And as it moves, we're also going to, and we will use the free transform tool to do all of this. But as we move the palm tree up toward the spaceship, we're also going to stretch it, make it look like it's being like a vacuum is sucking sucking the palm tree up in there. And then we're also going to apply a scale, or we're going to scale it down. So we're going to apply a scaling technique to make the palm tree smaller and just create the illusion that it's being sucked up into that spaceship. And we're going to do that, again, using the frame-by-frame animation technique. So now the palm tree is completely illuminated. Bring your playhead down the timeline, I don't know, about 8-10 frames, something like that. And we're going to create a new keyframe. So just hit F6. And this is where things are going to begin to change with the colorful palm. So before that, it just sits there and becomes more visible. And now it's going to start to move up into the spaceship. So make sure that you have the free transform tool selected and select your object through the keyframe, just like that. And now the object is selected. So this marks the spot of the location of the palm tree at this point in the timeline. So it's going to be sitting here. And then we're going to create another keyframe, just a few frames down. I don't know, 5 or 6, it's really up to you. Hit F6 to create a new keyframe, and now we're going to see the change begin to happen. Oops, let me undo this. So if you notice when I just scaled this, it scaled in 2 directions, vertically. And that's really not what we want. We want this to scale from the bottom up. So to do that, we're going to move this is called I call it a transformation point. And it's the point at which it determines where the object can rotate. It also determines how it's going to scale. But this could be moved to a new location. You could anchor your object anywhere you want within this bounding box and change the rotation point. And in our case, we're going to change the scaling point. So I'm going to scale it upward, and I'm also going to scale it inward a little bit. So that's the first movement. I'm going to bring my playhead down a few frames, create a new keyframe. So select the frame, press F6 to create a keyframe, and now we're going to move the palm tree up a little bit. And we're going to scale it. And I'm doing it from the corner scaling handle. I'm going to check my work really quick to make sure I like the way it looks. It's looking okay. And I'll bring my playhead down a few more frames. And I'm going to create a keyframe at that place in the timeline. And then I'm going to create the next change of my object. So I'm going to move it up a little bit. Oops, wow, that went crazy. Okay, and I might just move it and not scale it at this point. It's starting to disappear behind the palm tree, or behind the spaceship. And then I'll bring my playhead out a few more frames, select a frame in the timeline, press F6 to create a keyframe. I keep scaling it from the wrong end. Now I'm going to move my scaling point to the top of my object and reset it at this keyframe. And then scale it from the bottom up so it looks like it's being tucked up in there. In fact, I might do it in a couple of steps. So I might move it here, and then a few more frames down, finish the process. So I'll create one more keyframe and grab it from the bottom up, and boom, there it is, it's gone. So now I'm just going to bring my playhead back a few frames and kind of run through that and see what I think about that. And there it goes. And now I'm going to play it at real speed. Just hit return and watch the animation. Very nice. So now we have a tree that's been sucked up into the spaceship. And the last thing we're going to do is, well, two things. We're going to animate the ray beam tucking itself up into the spaceship, and then we're going to animate the spaceship to fly off into the distance. So let's find our ray beam layer. It's right here. Beam ray. I keep calling it ray beam. And we're going to scrub through the timeline and go back to where the palm tree gets sucked up into the spaceship. And so this ray beam has been visible this whole time. Now it's time to set a keyframe to denote change in the ray beam. And in fact, right after the last keyframe of the colorful palm, let's just go ahead and insert a blank keyframe. Because remember, that spaceship is going to move, and when it moves, that palm tree will be sitting there all squinched up, still visible. So we need to make sure that it is not visible when the spaceship moves. So go back to the colorful palm layer, go back to the final keyframe where the palm disappears into the spaceship. And right after that last keyframe, you're going to control click or right click, whatever works best for you, and you're going to insert a blank keyframe. And now we know that that will not be visible anymore. Now at this point is when we want to start the animation for the ray beam to disappear. So let's go down to the, or beam ray. So let's go down to the beam ray layer, and we're just going to hit F6 and create a keyframe. So this marks the spot of where this visual element is getting ready to change. So between this keyframe and this keyframe, the object is just visible. It's not changing in any way. It's just visible. But now at this keyframe, this object is getting ready to change. So we're going to animate it. Let's try and animate it the same way we did the palm tree. Let's just see how that works. So I'm going to come out a few frames and create a keyframe. And I'm going to start the process with my free transform tool. I'm going to select the beam ray. Oh, I got to unlock the beam ray layer. I'm going to lock all the rest of my layers. And I'm going to have my properties window available to me as well, because I might even play around with setting opacity changes. Not quite sure yet. So now I can select my beam ray, and I'm going to move the transformation point to the bottom. No, wait a minute. I'm going to move it to the top of the shape. And I'm going to scale it up just a few increments. And I'm going to tap on this shape really quick so that in my properties window, I get the color fill and style box. And where down here where you can change the alpha, let's just take it down about 80%. There we go. Now I'm going to come out a few more frames in the beam ray timeline layer. And I'm going to select a keyframe, select a frame and then insert a keyframe. And then at this keyframe, I'm just going to add a little bit more of this scaling technique and changing of opacity. So I'm going to move the beam up a little bit more. I'm scaling it up toward the spaceship. And then I'm going to reduce the opacity down to, let's say, 60%. So that's what we have. And I'm going to come out in the timeline a few more frames. Click a frame and add a keyframe. And this time I'm going to scale it in a little bit, make it a little more narrow. So I'm scaling from the side scaling handle, and I'm also going to tuck it up in there just a little bit more. And let's give this just a little bit of an opacity change. Let's take it down to 40%. That went way too far. There we go. And let's go out a few more frames in the timeline for the beam ray layer. Hit F6. I'm going to scale it from the side one more time and from the bottom one more time and take it down to 20. And then one last keyframe a few frames out. And it's just going to disappear. And then right after that keyframe, what are we going to insert? A blank keyframe. So I'm going to do that by holding the control key down and clicking one time on the little mouse pad here and choose insert blank keyframe. Yes. Oh, do you have a question? Do you have a question? Oh, okay.
So for the beam ray, so I'm not gonna lie, I don't know what happened.
That's okay. What happened? Huh?
I was still messing with the palm string.
So you need help with the beam ray?
Yeah.
Okay. So what I did was I created a keyframe in the same column where I created the final keyframe for the colorful palm when it disappears into the spaceship. Okay. And so now it's time to tuck the ray beam up into the spaceship. And so I created a keyframe right beneath that final keyframe. And then I came out a few frames. I didn't do anything with the ray beam at this point. Okay. And then I came out to a few frames and created a new keyframe. And at that point, then very important, I wanted it to tuck up into the spaceship. So I wanted to move the transformation point up to the top edge of that shape and have it scale upward instead of toward the center of that shape. And so I moved the transformation point, and then I just scaled the space or the ray beam or the beam ray from the bottom scaling handle up, just a small increment. And then I also adjusted the opacity to 80%. So each time I created a new keyframe and changed that ray beam to make it smaller and make less of it, I also reduced the opacity of the color.
So you did 1%?
The first percentage that I changed was I brought it down to 80%. So it's 80% visible. And then in the next keyframe, I made the ray beam smaller, so I scaled it upward again from this bottom scaling handle, and then I also reduced the opacity to 60%. And then in the next keyframe, I scaled the beam ray from the sides and the bottom to make it more narrow and shorter, and then I reduced the opacity to 40%.
How do you go back? Is it Command Z?
Command Z takes you back, yes.
Like it deletes?
It takes out those steps. Okay, so the last thing we want to do is we want to animate the spaceship flying off, and we're going to add some sound to this little story as well. So I'm going to bring my playhead back down to where the beam ray disappears. And I'm going to make sure that that layer is locked. I don't want to mess anything up there. And I'm going to go to my spaceship layer. And I want to go to the spaceship front layer. So remember that, because the previous one is no longer visible because that one became invisible after it finished flying behind the moon. So the spaceship front layer should be at the top of your layer stack. And I'm going to select a frame on that layer. I'm going to unlock that layer as well. I'll select a frame and hit F6 to create a keyframe. So this whole time is just sitting there until the ray beam disappears. And now we have a keyframe that's going to show changes in this object. So I'm going to select the object through the keyframe. I'm still using the free transform tool, and you can animate it however you want. So I might have it, kind of hover a little bit just for a second, kind of moving up and down, a little bit back and forth. And I'll do that with just creating keyframes, every few I don't know, 3 or 4 frames in the timeline. So at this keyframe, the spaceship will dip a little bit. I'll move out a few frames, create another keyframe. It'll hover back up. And maybe a few frames out, I'll have it kind of move to the side a little bit, and then also give it a little bit of a rotation. Then I'll move out into the timeline a little bit and create another keyframe. And now it's time for it to start to jet off. So I'm just going to move it a little bit. And then I'm going to create another keyframe a few frames down. I'll move it again a little bit more. And this time I'm going to give a little bit of a scale, but I'm going to hold the shift key down when I scale it because I want to keep its proportions constrained. I don't want to distort it and stretch it. I'm going to find another place in the timeline where I want to create another keyframe. Hit F6. And I'm going to move the spaceship on a little bit more. And maybe scale it down a little bit more. And come out a few more frames. Create another keyframe. Maybe rotate it to be a little more flat. And move it up. And hold shift and scale it down. Come out a few more frames, hit F6, and then you can just move it on out of the scene. Might do one last keyframe. And now it's gone. So we want some sound to go along with this storytelling process. And one sound that I want to add is a sound that just exists in the background the whole time. So I'm going to lock all of my layers. And I'm going to create a new layer. It doesn't matter where the layer is because it's sound, so it's not going to interfere with the visibility of anything in our composition. And I'm going to call this one background noise. Here we go. And that noise is going to be the star drive rumble. So let's sample that really quick. So you'll find it in the layer, in the library. Hit the little play button. And that's going to be happening in the background the whole time. And it's a long sound bite, so it should last the whole animation. And that's probably good enough. You can hear where it fades out, and if your animation is longer than the sound, you can just reapply the sound to that animation so that it's more continuous. All right, so I'm going to add the sound by just making sure I have that keyframe selected and drag it to the stage. And there we go. Okay, that is not supposed to happen. Don't know. I mean, when I sample it, it sounds like this, and that's what I want. Okay, so has anybody added the sound to their timeline, and is it working for you? I'm going to pause this for a second. All right, so I've run into some snags on this last part. For some reason, my sound just isn't working. Doesn't sound right. When I sample it through the library, it sounds fine. It's exactly what I'm looking for. And these are sound assets that I borrowed from another open file, because the one in my recovered spaceship palm tree nav file, for some reason, those sound assets are corrupted. And I can't even sample them. So I opened a previous file where I knew that those assets were still functional and intact. And I was able to access that file's library through my library of this recover file. And, and I'm looking at the assets that are actually in this file here that's not the active file at the moment. And this scene has not been animated yet, but all of the sound works fine. It has all of the sound elements that I'm looking for. Like that. That's a lovely one. And this one. And this one. And this one. So I want to incorporate all of these sounds into my scene, but I can't. So this is where you guys are going to be on your own. But I'm going to talk you through. I'm going to explain to you how to do this, okay? So we want to sync sound events with visual events, right? Because we're trying to tell a story. So in the beginning of this, we just see the spaceship flying in, and it flies around, and then it hovers over the palm tree and kind of checks it out. So during that whole time, during those sequences, we need some kind of background noise. And so my vision was to use this noise right here. Not in this one, because it's corrupt, as you can tell. So in this file, I want to use the and it should work fine in your files, because I've heard you guys sample your sound bites and they sound like they're intact. So we're going to use the star drive rumble sound. It's this sound right here. And it's just going to play in the background throughout the whole animation. So to add this sound, you want to create a layer to put that sound on. So just go ahead and create a new layer. So I had created a layer here, but my sound is corrupt, so I can't really use that. You can name the layer. The first go around, I actually named it background layer. So it would be a good idea to name it so you know that that's the background layer sound, or the background sound. And then you'll create a keyframe, and then just drag that sound asset from the library to the stage. At the very beginning of the timeline for that new layer that you've created. And it might have already created a blank keyframe for you. And if that's the case, then just select that blank keyframe and make sure that it's selected, and then add the sound. And that will be at the very first frame. Drag the sound to the stage. Go ahead and do that. And then hit return on your keyboard. And I want to make sure that it's playing okay for you guys in your compositions. Okay, so we have two more sound elements that we want to add to our composition. I'm just going to get rid of that layer because that is obnoxious. So I'm just going to have to talk you through it because I don't have sound to work with. So you've added the star drive rumble sound in the background, so that should be sounding like this. So that should be playing in the background. And then when the spaceship makes it to the palm tree, so right about here, kind of dances around, and when it starts to shoot out those little light beams, that would be a good place to insert some sound. So you would want to create a new layer and add a keyframe right beneath the keyframe of where the little light rays begin to shoot out, where that animated drawing technique begins to happen. You'll create a keyframe at that level, wherever your layer is, and you're going to sample these sounds and find one that you think would sound appropriate for the sound of those little light beams checking out the palm tree. So I kind of like warp engineering 01 for the light beam show. So remember the light beams, they dart out twice with that animated drawing effect. So they draw in, and then they go back up, and then they do that one more time. So I think for each of these events, right beneath the first keyframe of each of these events, you should add, and make sure you don't follow my instruction at this portion of the video, because I'm selecting right now a frame on a layer that really does exist in this animation. I'm not going to create a keyframe here, but I'm just demonstrating how it should look. When you create that blank layer for the next sound bite, you need to create a keyframe right beneath the keyframe where those lightning lasers begin to shoot out. And I would add warp engineering 01 to that place in the timeline, and then I'd create a second keyframe right beneath the first keyframe of the second presentation of those laser beams. I would create another keyframe on that same sound layer and add that warp engineering sound once again. So when you create those keyframes, you don't drag the asset to the keyframe. You make sure that blank keyframe is selected, and then you drag that sound asset to the stage. And that will, when that blank keyframe is selected, that will punctuate the exact place in the timeline where that sound needs to start. We want it to start with that animated drawing technique, and we want that to happen twice in sync. Okay, so you guys go ahead and do that. I'm going to walk around, check on you, let you ask some questions, and then we'll add the last bit of sound. So our focus is to sync a sound event with a visual event. Okay, everybody's doing great. The last thing you got to do is add the sound for the spaceship taking off. So you'll create a new layer for that, and you will create a keyframe at the location. I would say, oh wait, you know what? I think the best thing would be to create a dramatic sound effect where the palm tree gets sucked up into the spaceship. So that sound, I think, would be, let me go back to my other file here. Maybe that. So warp engineering 2. And then I would add the sound for that motion of the palm tree disappearing into the spaceship. And if it's long enough, you can even let it overlap into where the beam ray sucks up into the spaceship as well. So that would be a good place for that sound. So I would start that process right where the light becomes real visible of from the beam. Maybe start the sound right about there at that point in the timeline. So it would sound like this. So that would be the sound of it checking, with the beam and sucking up the spaceship. And then the last sound, and you'll have to create another layer for this, but it'll be the sound of the spaceship sailing off into space. So it will be around this part of the timeline where the beam ray has completely disappeared into the spaceship, and now the spaceship is getting ready to fly off into space. And I think this would be a great place right here to insert this sound. Wait, let me go to my other file. Or that could be a good one for sucking up the palm tree. Either one. I mean, you could switch them around, whatever you want. But just make sure that those sound events sync with what's going on visually, with the beam ray and the palm tree and the spaceship flying off into outer space. And that is it for today's demonstration. So I'll get this video uploaded later today. I'm terribly sorry that I was not able to demonstrate for you the sound portion of this because my file is screwed up. So there's just nothing I can do about that. But I walked around the room. You guys seem to be doing well. So I'm going to leave you with it. And when you get this finished, just save your file and submit that file in Blackboard. And I will download your animation and look at it and grade it and give you some feedback. Next week, we're going to start a new unit. We're going to explore a new animation technique called tweening. Motion tweening, classic tweens, and shape tweens. But the two tweens that we're really going to focus on in the next unit are going to be shape tweens and classic tweens. Then we'll move on to motion tweens in Unit 4. So that's it for today, folks.